Is the Penguin setting up an adaptation of No Man's Land from Gotham? The Penguin series so far has been juggling some of the most prominent aspects of Batman's mythos, and has done justice to many of his most important details. And so far, one of the best things about this universe is its depiction of Gotham. This is one of the most vibrant and in-depth depictions of Gotham City as a complete environment, with a life of its own aside from simply being a place for Batman stories to take place in. Not only has the series shown us what is probably the best live-action depiction of Arkham Asylum, but the entire city within the universe of the Batman is alive and complex. It has an identity that surpasses many other Batman projects. Gotham is essentially its own character, and so we have to wonder how this character will be treated moving forward. And it's possible that this may end up being an adaptation of the No Man's Land story. In episode 2 of The Penguin, we learned that Crown Heights was hit the hardest by the Riddler's flooding, and Victor lost the entirety of his family and his neighborhood when the Riddler's attack commenced. This was a very poor corner of the city already, and in the episode it's referred to as No Man's Land, which is what gives way to this theory, as this line may be an intentional reference to the story. In the story, Gotham City was a victim of a magnitude 7.6 earthquake, which ravaged the landscape and left more than 5,000 people dead, which was the tipping point for Gotham as a city and a society. We know that Gotham has been ravaged by corruption and crime for decades, and for so many years it's been holding on by a thread. But this was the straw that broke Gotham's back. The US government finally decided that Gotham was far too gone. Offering aid for the city would be effectively burning money without actually offering Gotham anything in the way of reparations or progress, since the city was just that deeply corroded already. The government decided to quarantine Gotham by destroying all bridges in and out of the city, leaving it to its own devices, calling it No Man's Land and leaving the city to rot. The National Guard barricaded the surrounding areas past the harbor in order to ensure that no one could escape, and the Justice League was the only external aid that anyone from Gotham ever saw. Even though many members of the League did their best to help Gotham, they were still stretched thin since the rest of the world needed them as well. Their biggest fight was keeping the outside forces from encroaching on Gotham and completely taking over. If the Justice League had not gotten involved, then it's highly likely that for some foreign power, corporation, rival government, or other organization would have used military force to conquer Gotham, since they were technically not invading American soil any longer. Anyone with any army was bidding on Gotham, which was now up for grabs. And while the fight outside was being waged by the Justice League, the battle within Gotham was far worse. Arkham and Blackgate had been officially abandoned, and the inmates of both locations conducted their own respective jailbreaks, flooding the streets with just about everyone that Gotham City had ever put away. Batman's rogues were left to run amok, and the population of Blackgate was quick to join up with several warring gangs and crime families that were all throwing in on their own parade. Without legal ramifications, they took much more violent approaches to carving out territory of Gotham, and this was one of the bloodiest crime waves that the city had ever seen. Even though the GCPD is corrupt to its core, so many of the officers on the job had been bought off by the criminals. They were still having to go through the motions though, and at least pretended to uphold the rule of law. The corruption of Gotham's courts and law enforcement is underhanded, so criminals usually get off quietly while the local government gets to maintain the illusion that they are actually doing their job. Without any ties to the United States, however, the police force had no law to uphold except for that which they put in place. But whatever ruling faction was controlling the police system, judges and courts now essentially meant nothing, since again there was no law that they could be beholden to, and so Gotham became completely lost to the wolves. The only punishment to be delivered was no longer civil or legal. The only way to identify or punish a crime was through brute force and completely autonomous self-defense. For the first 100 days of No Man's Land, Bruce Wayne made his way to Washington, D.C. in order to fight the case politically, since no amount of gadgetry and combat would save the city. Batman would be fighting an unwinnable war though, and there was quite literally nothing that Batman possibly could have done. So he leveraged his identity as Bruce Wayne to try and make a real change. What this meant, however, is that Gotham was not only left with its worst crime surge in history, but Batman also seemingly abandoned the city. Even the most lawless Arkham patients would think twice about committing crimes if they believed that there was even a possibility that they could run into the Batman. Even when the police don't scare these criminals, Batman certainly does. But this left the heroes like Oracle and Huntress to pick up where Bruce Wayne left off. The Huntress even temporarily adopted the identity of Batgirl in order to ensure that the symbol of Batman was left behind and was still in effect. But not only was the crime at an all-time high in Gotham, but so too was the morale of the criminals. Even Gordon believed that Batman had abandoned the city, and as a former Gotham police officer who had a direct hand in imprisoning many of them, he was in more danger than just about anyone in the entire city. Many of these story beats are seen in The Dark Knight Rises, and when Batman returns in that movie, we see that he was burned a large bat into the side of a building to announce his return. This is pulled from the Huntress tagging parts of the city with the Bat logo in order to mark her territory, and continue to instill fear in the lawless who would take advantage of the weak. The Penguin during this time was able to establish a link to the outside world, and so he designed a system that allowed him to smuggle items into the city so they could then be bought by the highest bidder, making him extremely powerful. Money in Gotham, though, was worthless, so the anarchy within Gotham ran on a barter system where people would trade goods and services directly. But this didn't stop the Penguin from securing his safety due to his asset. He even began communicating with Mercy Graves on behalf of Lex Luthor, who was plotting a takeover if they were able to get the proper pieces in place and circumvent the Justice League, who still was fighting off foreign powers at the time. Two-Face, Victor Zsasz, Mr. Freeze, they had all conquered territory and were running their own operations, complete with alliances and wars between one another. Lex Luthor was even able to deputize Bane from beyond the walls of Gotham in order to make preparations for LexCorp's expansion. In the end, it was actually Luthor who was able to have Gotham be reinstated personally by funding an extensive cleanup effort, and it was actually Superman's greatest rival that got Gotham back on its feet. On the surface, this was a great generous act of kindness, conducted by a benefactor who cared, and who wanted to see Gotham back to its former glory. As Gotham did have its highlights, most of the time Gotham is defined in comics as a bleak, poor, crime-ridden neighborhoods that Batman patrols, but that's most of the adventures that we read about following these corners of the city. Gotham is also home to the high life, Bruce Wayne's half of the city, with the fanciest clubs, museums, theaters, and entertainment in the entire world. Gotham is a city that people go to with the intention of making it big, and only when they fail do they drip down into the gutter and become part of the underside of the city. The public believed that Lex Luthor was sincerely attempting to save the city out of the goodness of his heart, but knowing Lex, there was bound to be an ulterior motive. Using patsies like Bane, he was able to instill his own less-than-legal operation in Gotham, and since he was rebuilding the city from the ground up, he got to embed these operations into the very bones of the city. Luthor got just as deeply entrenched in Gotham's corruption as the courts or law enforcement. Only now, it was Luthor pulling the strings. Legally, he was able to capitalize on his investment by opening several LexCorp subsidiaries in the city in order to stimulate the economy, bringing ethical jobs back to Gotham, expanding his empire in the process. But extra legally, he made himself an underhanded fortune. Crime belonged to Lex Luthor, and in the universe of the Batman, it seems like some of the pieces may already be in place for an adaptation of No Man's Land. The Riddler's flood caused much of the same damage that we saw in the No Man's Land story in the comics, and it may only take a few more small nudges to finally push Gotham over the edge. Right now, we know that FEMA, the federal government, are helping the reconstitution of the effort of the city, but this can only last so long, and it may only take one more large-scale disaster to finally push the Batman into No Man's Land. Since the universe so far doesn't have an iteration of Luthor yet though, and this has to introduce one of Gotham's most famous rogues, and it would be difficult to fully capitalize on the scope of the story arc at this point in Batman's career, so it would likely be a softer adaptation of No Man's Land than what we saw in the comics, but it could still happen. We know that Sophia Falcone has now risen to power and has proposed an alliance with Salvatore Maroni, and we know that the Penguin is in the midst of reconstructing a highly lucrative shrooms operation. This means that when the Batman returns, it will be against the backdrop of a legal system that has been shredded by the flood and overrun with these main crime families. Even if legally Gotham still belongs to the United States, we may feel the effects of No Man's Land in the Batman 2. But anyway, friends, what do you think of No Man's Land and the event in the story? And is this an intentional reference to the future of the Batman universe? As always, my friends, smash that subscribe button for more Batman lore, and have a great day.